WAPE, Channel 69.
Do you remember?
Do you remember?
Hello, this is Honest John. Welcome back to this YouTube site dedicated to celebrating the Big Ape in Jacksonville. I've got something a little different for you this time. Although it involves the Big Ape, it is actually about a conspiracy theory that came along back in 1969. It was the biggest conspiracy theory ever involving a rock and roll group. And of course, since it was the biggest conspiracy theory, it had to involve the Beatles. You may have heard about it as the Paul is dead rumor. But it was a little more than a rumor. It was really a conspiracy theory. This happened in 1969. A guy from Michigan wrote a newspaper article that said he had gone through all kinds of material from the Beatles, and specifically these 4 albums, and we'll get into them in just a little while. And he had found all kinds of little clues that Paul McCartney was dead. The conspiracy was that Paul had died in the wreck of his Aston Martin on a dark and windy and rainy British night, of course, and that the Beatles had substituted somebody for Paul, and that had pulled something over on everybody. Then, however, I suppose seeking restitution or redemption, they decided to come clean, but being a true conspiracy theory, they couldn't just come out with something that could be proved. They had to put little sneaky clues in where they could to reveal the truth to those who were really in the know. Before I play this for you, I'll warn you it's going to seem incredibly insipid and absolutely without any substance. And the reason for that is because it's absolutely without any substance. But I'll let you judge for yourself. Something different this time. Usually behind the audio portions of these posts that I put on YouTube, I put pictures and documents and things like that. And I feel like maybe it's time to do a little something different. I always enjoyed listening to the radio when I was in the car. So I thought I'll just put you in a car and you can listen to it on the way from in the vicinity of Pinehurst, North Carolina, to my house. So I hope you enjoy that. If so, let me know. So if you're ready, we're going to climb on board and get this machine running, and we're going to find out what is the truth about this,
Hello, this is Honest John. Is Paul McCartney dead or alive?
Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away.
In the Tuesday, October 14th, 1969 edition of the Michigan Daily newspaper, a man named Fred Laborde said that Paul McCartney was killed in the crash of his Aston Martin on a cold, rainy night in early November 1966 after leaving EMI recording studios tired, sad, and dejected.
Why don't we just do it in the road?
Yet Paul McCartney writes, he records, he has his picture taken, he makes movies, appears on television, gets married, and has a child.
Don't we do it?
It's incredible and unbelievable, yet it's interesting.
Mr. Moonlight.
For the next few minutes, let's look at the alleged facts that Mr. Laborde sets down in print. Look at the pictures, play the records forward and backward, and take each point separately. I personally do not believe Mr. Laborde for the simple reason that I've seen Paul on television, I've seen his record covers, seen his pictures, and heard his records. I don't believe it's physically possible to carry out an impersonation of anyone as well known as Paul McCartney. If the necessary plastic surgery was performed on an imposter, still no one could duplicate his mannerisms, his vocal patterns, and certainly not his talent. I believe the facts we discuss are significant. That is, I believe the Beatles planned them to tell us something. But I do not believe the Beatles planned them to tell us that Paul McCartney is dead.
Now somewhere in the black mining hills of Dakota there lived a young boy named Rocky Raccoon.
Mr. Laborde in his article said that on the night of the auto accident, George buried Paul, Ringo conducted the services, and John went into seclusion for 3 days of meditation. Thus the first point. On the Abbey Road album cover, George is dressed in denim, signifying, supposedly, digging the grave. Ringo is dressed in black, like a minister, and John wears white, signifying, supposedly, the purity of meditation. And Paul is barefooted because the English bury their dead barefooted. And of course, we Americans often bury our dead barefooted. However, George dresses in denim often. As a matter of fact, his fans have known for many years of his fondness for wearing jeans. Ringo often dresses in black, and John has made most of his TV appearances lately wearing a white suit. And we all go barefoot occasionally.
Who knows how long I've loved you?
The plan, according to Mr. Labor, was thought up by John and told to the other Beatles. The alleged plan was to bring in an imposter and let him assume the identity of Paul McCartney, all the while letting the rest of the world know of Paul's death a little at a time by dropping hints in their songs and album covers. Mr. Labor, in his article from the Michigan Daily, says that voice prints of the original Paul and his alleged impersonator have proved that the new Paul is not the old Paul. But as far as I can determine, no voice print has ever been used in a court of law, and according to discussions I have seen on television, voice prints are far from perfected. They just don't work. But let's listen to Paul McCartney before November 1966 and after November 1966. Compare the voices and see what you think. Are they the same? Now, in each comparison that follows, pre-November 1966 recordings will come first, and recordings made after November 1966 will come second. Listen.
Michelle, my belle, these are words that go together well. Once there was a way to get back homeward. Once there was a way to get back home. Sleep, pretty darling, do not cry, and I will sing a lullaby. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where the wedding was being. It's in a dream. Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head.
The first album recorded after Paul's alleged mishap was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, supposedly worked on by George Martin and John Lennon. This album is supposedly filled with clues about the death. The album cover portrays a grave scene with the word Beatles written in flowers across the top of the grave. Mr. Labor's article says that the guitar in yellow flowers is Paul's bass. Or if you prefer, it isn't a guitar or a bass at all, but the initial P. The more obvious explanation is that the new Beatles, that is the turned-on, newly found acid rock and drug-oriented Beatles, all four alive and well, are burying the old, good guy, nice young men Beatles, which never were in the first place. The guitar on the cover is just that, a guitar. And the turned-on, tell-it-like-it-is Beatles are getting rid of their old image.
Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock as the day begins.
On the inside cover of Sgt. Pepper's, Mr. Labor points out that on Paul's, that is supposedly the new Paul, the impersonator, about whom I'll tell you more later, is wearing an arm patch with the initials OPD, which mean officially pronounced dead, similar to the DOA, or dead on arrival, which American officials use. In fact, the initial D on the arm patch is obscured. It may not be a D at all. Mr. Labor also states that the medal worn by Paul on the inside cover picture is a British medal usually awarded posthumously to people who die a hero's death. Well, that may be, but George in the same picture is wearing the very same medal. What does that mean? Well, it probably means that whoever was in charge of costumes for the Sgt. Pepper album cover picked up any medal he could find for decoration and pinned them on wherever they looked the best. Also on the back cover of the Sgt. Pepper album, all the Beatles face the camera except Paul, and he has his back to the camera. And that is supposed to mean something, but I don't know what. It shouldn't mean that they're trying to hide his face, because on the same album, in the middle and front covers, Paul's face is in plain view.
When I get older, losing my head, many years from now.
Now let's look at the songs in Sgt. Pepper. Mr. Labor, in his article, points to numerous passages of lyrics and says they're significant. Mr. Laborde says the top of Paul's head was sheared off in the accident, and his features were difficult to recognize.
A crowd of people stood on the stairs. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the house before.
However, we must remember that the middle verse of A Day in the Life was sung by Paul McCartney, and I don't believe an imposter could so closely duplicate his voice. I'm sure you've seen impersonators on television, and they're professionals, yet they cannot duplicate a voice really well enough to fool anyone. And they practice in front of a mirror for hours on end, and they're pretty good, but they just can't be that good. Just about everybody I've talked to concerning this alleged death of Paul McCartney has mentioned Strawberry Fields Forever. I've heard things like Strawberry Fields is a graveyard in England, and things like that I can't verify, and I can't talk about intelligently because I'm not familiar with English graveyards. However, Mr. Laborde, in the article that started the whole thing, says that at the end of the song, John Lennon sings, "I buried Paul," or else he says it, "I buried Paul," those words. He says you have to play that part at 45 RPMs, and I'll do that for you in a minute. But first, let me give you some background into Strawberry Fields Forever. It was written by John Lennon while he was in the desert of Spain filming the movie How I Won the War. John Lennon was there with his wife, his first wife, and a fellow actor and his wife. They lived in a house in the desert by a railroad track. He was so bored that when he wrote the song, he wrote a train sequence into the end of the song, because in the place they lived, every night the train would go by, and he and his wife had a standing joke with the other actor and his wife as to who would be the first to get on that train and leave the horrible place. Now keep in mind that he was so bored that he would write that train, the way out of there, into Strawberry Fields, and recorded it into the song when he got into the studio. Now let me play that part for you. It'll give you some background as to how bored he was, and I want to stress the word bored, when he wrote the song. He even portrayed in the song a train getting out of that horrible place. Here's the train. Now listen. That sequence, which I will refer to as the train sequence, comes toward the end of the song, Strawberry Fields Forever. Okay, now I'm going to play the very end of the song at 45 RPMs as instructed by Mr. Laborde in his article, and let you hear the words, "I am very bored," or "I buried Paul." Now keep in mind the English accents and listen for "I am very bored," which Mr. Laborde says is "I buried Paul." I'll play it several times for you, and you'll have to listen closely. Is it, "I am very bored," or is it, "I buried Paul"? Listen. Strawberry Fields Forever was released as a single and as part of the Magical Mystery Tour album, which Mr. Laborde says is chock full of veiled references to Paul's death on that, quote, "rainy, tragic night," end quote. For instance, Mr. Laborde says that the mystic sign of death is a hand held behind the head. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not, but in many pictures in the Magical Mystery Tour booklet, you'll notice Paul has a hand behind his head. But if you'll notice, there's an awful lot of waving being done, and everyone has a hand behind their head at one time or another. Also on page 3 of the booklet, Paul is seated in front of a sign saying, "I, you, was." I, you, was, with obvious implications. On page 13 of the booklet, Paul is portrayed in black trousers and no shoes, again the reference to British burial customs. On that same page, the empty shoes, which obviously Paul has just taken off, are beside Ringo's drums. Mr. Laborde says empty shoes are a Grecian symbol of death. Also on page 23 of the booklet, all the Beatles wear red roses in their lapels except Paul, and his is black. And as I said earlier, I do believe all these things are significant. They do mean something, but I hardly believe that they mean Paul is dead. Also, since the movie Magical Mystery Tour hasn't played in Jacksonville, some of the points could be part of the plot of the movie, but since I haven't seen it, most of us haven't seen it, I just don't know.
I am the Eggman. I am the Eggman. I am the walrus.
Mr. Labor, in the article that started the rumors flying, says that walrus is Greek for corpse. In my dictionary, all it says is that walrus is derived from a strange-looking word which means sea elephant. In references to Greek mythology as I remember it from college, walrus refers in some cases to mermaids. Mr. Labor says that if the walrus, the song The Walrus, is played backward, the words "Paul is dead" can be plainly heard. I listened, and I heard this. Those are the only words I could distinguish in the whole song played backwards. Something like Sarah ran, and they ran, and they ran. Listen again. Now for the hard part. If Paul McCartney did actually die in the crash of his Aston Martin on that cold, rainy night in early November 1966 after an unsuccessful recording session, who is the fellow who sings exactly like him, looks exactly like him, has assumed his mannerisms, his customs, who married Linda Eastman and had a child? Mr. Labor says the man's name is really William Campbell, an orphan from Scotland who was found in a Paul McCartney look-alike contest. According to Labor, his picture can be seen in the lower left-hand corner of the picture collage released as a part of the double album called The Beatles. Once again, according to Labor, William Campbell's picture can be seen in the lower left-hand corner of the picture collage released as a part of the double album called The Beatles. Whoever this person is, he really doesn't look very much like Paul at all, and of course Labor says minor plastic surgery was required. Now, the picture above and to the right of the one I just mentioned shows Paul in a mustache and glasses. This supposedly is an interim disguise used by William Campbell while assuming the personality of the original, real Paul. In fact, this picture was released earlier by the official Beatle fan club and was identified by them as a disguise McCartney used while a tourist visiting the United States a couple of years ago.
Sexy Sadie, what have you done?
Mr. Labor says the original Paul McCartney was a homosexual and that girlfriends, therefore, were not a major problem in perpetrating the hoax. Labor says that the remaining Beatles paid Jane Asher to pretend to be Paul's steady girlfriend and to keep her mouth shut so that the rest of the female population of the world would stay away from him. And of course, this is pure conjecture that really doesn't deserve an answer. It's a very low form of argument. Also, Labor says that Paul seldom saw his remaining parent anyway, so that wasn't a problem. However, the Hunter Davies biography of the Beatles says that Paul often has his father and stepmother staying with him, and that Paul is very close to his brother Michael. Mr. Labor says that Paul has very few friends, but the biography states in several places that his house is always full of friends and relatives. The rest of Mr. Labor's arguments are based on interpretation of vague lyrics, played backward and more slowly than they were recorded, and often covered by loud music tracks. But this part of his argument is based on hard facts, and they just don't stand up. They just aren't true.
You become naked.
In the double album called The Beatles, Mr. Labor says there are hundreds of veiled references to the deceased Paul. He cites Dear Prudence, for instance, as a plea for Paul from John Lennon to come back and to open up his eyes. The song was written by Lennon while in India meditating with the Maharishi and refers to Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence, who stayed in her room all the time. Other references of Labor concern the song Revolution Number 9.
Number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9.
Labor says the entire album is a reconstruction of the whole story as seen by John Lennon. One of the points Labor makes is that of a man's voice saying, quote, "Turn me on, dead man," in the Revolution Number 9 song. And with a little imagination, such a phrase can be heard. Listen.
Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man.
That is the phrase Mr. Labor says is again, quote, "Turn me on, dead man," or "Turn me on, dead man." Listen again.
Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man.
Very easy to do. All you have to do is say number 9, number 9, number 9, and play it backward. Now this will be me doing the same thing. Listen. All you have to do is say number 9 and play it backwards. Is it a coincidence that number 9, said with a British accent, played backward, comes out like "Turn me on, Deadman"? I really don't know. However, if it isn't a coincidence, I can still see no reason to believe that John Lennon is trying to tell us Paul McCartney is dead.
Oh, darling.
Now for the Abbey Road album. Mr. Laborde says that Maxwell's Silver Hammer is a plea for religious justice with a dashed head for punishment. Octopus's Garden, he says, is a British seaman's term for the grave. I Want You, She's So Heavy is Lennon symbolically wrestling with Paul to pull him from the grave. Other points in Laborde's article are that the Beatles on the cover are leaving a cemetery. Again, George and Denham is the gravekeeper, Ringo is the minister, and John wears the virgin white of purity attained through meditation, while Paul, resurrected symbolically from his grave, still barefooted, carries a cigarette in his right hand. And Laborde is careful to point out that the original Paul was left-handed. So says the article that started the rumors. Time magazine, however, from a couple of weeks ago says the Beatles told them they have many recording studios to choose from, but the one they prefer is on Abbey Road. They call it the Abbey Road Studio. And the Beatles just decided to name their album after their favorite studio where it was recorded. The picture on the cover is one of them walking out of the studio after a recording session, walking across Abbey Road. It's simple, and it makes sense. Well, that's basically it. The story of the alleged death of Paul McCartney on that cold, rainy, early November evening in 1966. There were other references that I didn't bother with, some I didn't have time for. Other songs were mentioned that would have shed no further light on the subject, and I'm sure you can find at least 1,000 things to support him. Keep in mind, though, that when you start with a premise, it's easy to find something to back it up. Also, one other point worth mentioning, Mr. Laborde, in his article, made a reference to John Lennon as supposedly assuming a godlike attitude toward the entire hoax, a reference that I couldn't see pertained to the main theme of his article at all, only as a thinly veiled attempt to attack Mr. Lennon. And if that was so, then he wrote his article with prejudice. From my point of view, I see the entire newspaper article as a joke by Mr. Laborde. His name itself makes him suspect. Laborde can be translated from the French as the bore, someone who talks about things he knows absolutely nothing about, and someone to avoid. Perhaps the name Fred Laborde is fictitious. That doesn't matter. The fact remains that whoever dug all these facts from albums, whoever took the time to play all those songs backwards, spent a lot of time and energy, and perhaps they have discovered something. Certainly not that Paul McCartney's dead, but that the most elaborate practical joke ever in the history of the universe has been found out. Since I first heard I Want to Hold Your Hand, I've been a Beatle fan. They always give their best and nobody can top them. Therefore, I think it only fitting that the best practical joke ever should come from the Beatles. John Lennon, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney. All four very much alive and well, and still the best. I have enjoyed the joke, and I hope you have too. This is Honest John.
All you need is love, everybody. All you need is love.
Well, I told you it was completely without substance and it was vapid, but you notice that I got a little involved with it myself, and that's the nature of a conspiracy theory. So if you subscribe to a conspiracy theory, chances are in 50 years or so, you're going to look back and go, good God, what was that about? But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. A couple of points. Belinda and I went to London a few years ago. We flew into Paris, spent a few days there, and then we took the bullet train over to London. And I got to tell you, 192 miles an hour in a train is pretty damn cool. We enjoyed that. We arrived in London in what turned out to be the first really warm, sunny, beautiful weekend of spring, and those are extremely rare over there. And so everybody in London was out and having a good time and in a really good mood. We went up to the Abbey Road Studios, took one of those amazing black cabs up there with the cab drivers who just know everything and are just as cool as you can be. We went up there, spent an afternoon watching people run across the zebra crossing and try to pose as the Beatles did in the zebra crossing with traffic streaming by. And we also learned that up there, when you step off the curb, you don't look the same way as you do down here. So there was a lot of stepping off the curb and having tires screeching. I think they have a live video camera up there, like 24 hours a day. You might want to give it a look. You'll see sort of what goes on. Another thing I wanted to mention was this 20-minute little program that you just heard has wound up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm kind of proud of that, even though it is buried deep, deep, deep within the archives of that wonderful institution in Cleveland. It gives me a connection, and I'm kind of proud of that. Listen, I hope you enjoyed this. I'll have something else for you when I can. I would like to remind you again, if you should have audio of any of the guys that I worked with at the Big Ape in the late 60s and early 70s, I'd really love to have that and post it here so people can enjoy it. If you were there in the 60s, you no doubt remember the Paul is dead rumor, and it was part of the fun of being alive in that wonderful time to be young. Come back, see me sometime. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Till then, you take good care of yourself, and I hope you have a wonderful life.
All you need is love, love. Love is all you need. Love is all you need. Love is all.